The sword was already in the air. Duke Aldrich Vane stood in the gray morning light with his blade raised above his head, his jaw set, his eyes cold and focused. Around him, 30 soldiers stood in silence. The courtyard smelled of mud and smoke. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The woman kneeling in the dirt in front of him did not beg. She did not cry. She did not even look up at him. That was the thing that bothered him. Every person he had ever stood over in this position had begged, even the hardest soldiers, even the proudest lords. When a man lifts a sword over your head, something inside you breaks open, and out comes the fear. It is not a choice. It is simply what happens to people. But this woman, this thin, quiet woman with her arms bound in front of her, and her dark hair hanging loose around her face, simply knelt there and breathed, slowly, steadily, as if she had made some private peace with the world long before this moment. His arm held the sword still in the air. He told himself it was hesitation born from nothing important, a brief pause, the kind any man of discipline might take before carrying out a judgment, just to make certain his mind was clear and his hand was steady. He had carried out sentences before, not often. He was a commander, not a butcher. But when the law demanded it and the council agreed and the evidence was plain, he did not pass the duty to someone else. That was not who he was. A man who handed off difficult things was a man who could not be trusted with authority. So he stood there in the gray morning with his sword raised, and still she did not look up. Her name was Marin Doyle. He had read it from the record his secretary brought him the night before. Age, unknown, estimated between 25 and 30 years. Place of origin, unknown. Found among a group of villagers from the lowland settlement of Cairo, which his forces had come through 3 days ago while pushing back a supply line that had been feeding the enemy's eastern camp. She had no papers, no husband accounted for, no family that came forward to claim her, and she had been carrying, tucked inside the lining of her coat, a folded piece of paper that contained what his intelligence officer, a sharp and experienced man named Colonel Harwick Bream, identified as a coded message meant for enemy hands. That, Bream had told him with complete confidence, was damning enough on its own. But there was also the testimony of a man named Garrett Ossie, a local trader who said he had seen Marin on 2 occasions meeting with a man known to work for the other side. Ossie had given his account clearly and without being prompted in ways that might have shaped his words. He described what he saw, when he saw it, and where. 2 pieces of evidence. A woman with no alibi and no name in any record. The verdict had taken less than an hour. Aldrich's arm was beginning to ache. He became aware of this ache and found it strange, because he had held a sword above his head in combat for far longer than this without discomfort. His body was well trained, but something was pulling against the motion, not weakness, not fear, something else, something more specific, that he could not yet name. The woman's sleeve had shifted. That was what it was. He had not seen it happen because his eyes had been fixed forward, performing the final mental checks that he always ran before an execution. But something in his peripheral vision had caught a change, and now his attention moved toward it, and he found himself looking at her left arm rather than at the space above her neck where his focus should have been. Her sleeve had slid back toward her elbow. Her wrists were bound with rope, which meant her arms were together in front of her and her sleeves had bunched inward, and in the process of kneeling, the fabric of her left sleeve had ridden up her forearm. What he could see above the rope, running up along her inner forearm, was something that made the cold morning suddenly feel colder. He lowered the sword. It was not a slow, theatrical lowering. It was not something he did with any great ceremony. His arm simply came down. The tip of the sword touched the ground. His grip did not loosen, but the posture of execution left his body as cleanly as water leaving a hand. Around him, he could feel the confusion of 30 soldiers. He could feel the change in the air, the question forming in every man's chest without words. He stepped forward and crouched down. She still did not look at him. He was close enough now to see the marks on her arm clearly, without the soft distortion of distance. What he saw was not the result of a single event. What he saw had taken a long time. There were marks that had healed fully, pale against her skin, speaking of something that had happened years ago. There were marks that sat above those, newer, different in shape, and above those still others. They layered over each other like the rings inside a tree, each one a record of a separate time. He had been in enough battles to know what different kinds of wounds looked like. He knew the thin, clean lines that came from blades. He knew the rough, irregular shapes that came from falls or accident. He knew the wide burns that came from fire and the narrow ones that came from heated metal. He had seen field surgeries and field disasters. He had studied wounds on bodies the way a builder studies cracks in a wall, to understand what force had caused them and what damage remained. What he saw on her forearm was not any of those things. It was not battle damage. It was not accident. The shapes were too deliberate. The spacing between the different marks was too specific. And the layering, that record of injury spanning years rather than a single event, told a story that had nothing to do with war. He stood back up. "Cut her wrists free," he said. Sergeant Dowan, who was standing 3 feet to his right, hesitated for just a moment before stepping forward with his knife and slicing the rope. The woman's arms fell apart. She lowered them slowly to her sides. She still did not look up. "Bring her inside," Aldrich said. He walked back toward the main building of the garrison, without looking at his men. He did not explain himself. He did not owe anyone there an explanation. And beyond that, he did not yet have one to give. He only knew that something had shifted and that he was not the kind of man who pressed forward when something shifted, without first understanding what it was. The room they brought her to was a plain one. A long table, several chairs, a fire that had been built up an hour ago and was now giving off steady heat, maps on one wall, a jug of water on the table. Aldrich sat down on one side of the table and waited while 2 soldiers led Marin in through the door and then stepped back out and closed it. He had asked his attendant, a young man named Colin Graft, to stay in the room in the far corner in case he was needed. Marin stood for a moment near the door. "Sit down," Aldrich said. He kept his voice level. Not kind, not harsh. Simply informational. She came forward and sat. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. She was still not looking at him. Her eyes were aimed at a point on the table just beyond her own fingers. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it truthfully. Not because I am threatening you, but because the answer matters to what happens next." She said nothing. "Do you understand what I just said?" After a moment, she nodded. Small, careful. "The marks on your arm," he said. "Tell me about them." The silence that followed was not the silence of someone thinking about what lie to tell. He had sat across the table from enough people and enough interrogations to know the difference. The silence of a person considering a lie has a particular kind of energy, a busy quality, as if there is work happening just beneath the surface. This silence was different. It was the silence of someone deciding whether or not to open a door they had kept shut for a very long time. She raised her eyes and looked at him for the first time. They were gray, and they were steady. That was the thing that stayed with him about that first direct look. She was not defiant. She was not pleading. She was simply looking at him the way a person looks at a cliff face before beginning to climb, measuring the distance and deciding whether the effort was worth it. "Those marks," she said, "are from a man who is no longer my concern." Her voice was quiet. It was not shaking. "That is not an answer," he said. "It is the only answer I have," she said. "That does not require me to trust you." He looked at her for a long moment. "You came very close to dying this morning." "I know," she said. "And you said nothing in your defense during the council." "No," she said. "Why not?" She looked back down at her hands. "Because there was nothing to say that anyone in that room would have believed." The fire crackled. Outside the window, Aldrich could hear his soldiers going about the morning's work, voices carrying across the courtyard in the cold air, the sound of equipment being moved, and horses being watered. "I have been told," he said carefully, "that you were seen meeting with an enemy operative on 2 separate occasions." "I was seen talking to a man," she said. "I did not know who he worked for. That is what everyone says." "I imagine it is," she said, "because for most people it is probably true." He tapped one finger against the surface of the table, a habit. He did it when he was thinking. "The document found in your coat. Who gave it to you?" The pause was longer this time. "I was told to carry it," she said finally. "I was not told what was in it." "Told by whom?" She did not answer. "Marin," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. He noticed it himself as he said it, and noticed that she noticed it too. "I am not asking these questions to build a case against you. I already had a case. I was already about to act on it. Something stopped me. I am asking because I want to understand what I am looking at." She was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke. And once she began, she did not stop for a while. What she told him was not a dramatic recounting delivered with tears or theatrical pauses. It was plain. She spoke simply and in order, the way a person gives directions to a place they know very well. She had grown up near the border, the daughter of a man who traded in wool. Her father had owed money to a powerful man, a landowner in the Eastern Territories whose name was Calvern. When her father could not pay, the debt passed to her. She was 17 at the time. She spent 6 years in Calvern's household, not as a servant in the ordinary sense of the word, but as something closer to property. She was not permitted to leave. She was not permitted to speak to visitors. Calvern, who was not a man who wanted to be argued with, had ways of making his authority clear that did not require words. She said this last part without expression, without emphasis, as if she were describing the weather. When Calvern died, which he did unexpectedly during the third winter of the war, she had walked out of his estate and not looked back. She had no money. She had no documents. She had nothing except a set of skills she had quietly built over years of watching and listening, and a body that bore the record of everything Calvern's idea of authority had meant. She had made her way west. She had found work in Cairo, which was a small place but honest, doing laundry and mending for the families there. She had been there almost 2 years. A man she had known slightly from the market, a trader named Dunfrey, had come to her door one morning and asked if she would carry a letter to the next town for him. He said it was a business matter. He said he would pay her. She was careful by nature, but the request had seemed ordinary. She had agreed. She had not opened the letter. She did not believe, even now, that opening it would have told her much, since she had never studied the kind of code that the Duke's men apparently found inside it. She had been arrested 2 days later. She had sat in the council room and listened to the charges and said nothing because she had understood, in the way that people who have been powerless for a long time understand these things, that a woman with no papers and no name and no family, sitting in front of men in uniform, was not going to talk her way out of anything. So she had simply waited, and when the verdict came, she had waited some more. She had knelt in that courtyard, she said, and thought about what she was grateful for. She had found, to her surprise, that there were things. The 2 years in Cairo, the cold river she had washed her face in every morning, a dog that used to follow her home from the market, the quiet of her own room, small things, sufficient things. When she finished speaking, the fire had burned down a little. Aldrich had not moved. He had sat with his hands flat on the table and listened to all of it. He was good at listening. It was one of the things he had trained himself to do, because he had understood early that the information a person volunteers is never as useful as the information a person gives you without intending to, and what Marin Doyle had given him, without intending to, was something very specific. She was telling the truth. He could not have explained the mechanism by which he knew this, not in a way that would satisfy a court, but he had spent enough years in rooms with enough people to have developed a sense for the texture of honesty. It did not sound like performance. It did not sound rehearsed. It had the irregular, quiet quality of something remembered rather than invented. He stood up from the table. "You will remain here today," he said, "not as a prisoner. The door will not be locked. But I would ask that you stay in this building until I have had certain conversations." She looked up at him. "You have questions," he said. "I always have questions," she said. "I stopped expecting answers a long time ago." He looked at her for a moment. There was something in that sentence that landed in an uncomfortable place inside him, and he was honest enough with himself, in his private thoughts, to acknowledge it. Then he turned and went to find Colonel Bream. Outside the room, the morning had opened up. The clouds had thinned and a pale, cool light was coming across the courtyard. His sergeant was waiting just outside the door, and fell in beside him as he walked. "Sir," Dowan said quietly, "the men are asking." "They can wait," Aldrich said. "With respect, sir, when you raise a sword and then put it down in front of 30 witnesses, the men tend to—" "Tell them I am reviewing the evidence," Aldrich said. "That is the truth." Dowan said nothing more. Aldrich found Bream in the map room at the far end of the building, bent over a table covered in papers. Bream was a careful, methodical man who had served under 3 different commanders before Aldrich, and who had the reputation of being impossible to rattle. He looked up when Aldrich entered. "Sit down, Harwick," Aldrich said. He almost never used Bream's given name. The colonel registered this and sat. "The document," Aldrich said. "The one found in the Doyle woman's coat. Who identified it as coded?" "I did," Bream said. He said it calmly. He was not a man who apologized for his own conclusions. "Walk me through the analysis." Bream looked at him carefully. "You want me to walk you through it now?" "I want you to walk me through it now," Aldrich agreed. Bream reached across the table and pulled the paper from a leather folder. He placed it flat in front of Aldrich and began to explain. He pointed to certain groupings of letters. He explained the pattern he had identified. He explained the known coding methods used by the enemy in the Eastern Territories and how this document aligned with them. Aldrich listened. He asked 3 questions. Bream answered all 3 confidently. Then Aldrich said, "Is there another interpretation?" A pause, just a brief one. "There is always another interpretation," Bream said slowly, "but I assessed the most probable one and—" "What is the second most probable interpretation?" Aldrich said. Bream looked at the paper again. He was quiet for longer this time. Then he said, in a different tone, It could be a trading list. Aldrich said nothing. If you read it without the assumption of code, Bream continued, speaking more slowly now, the letter groupings are consistent with an abbreviated inventory. Wool grades and quantities. It would not be the first time I have found apparent patterns where the underlying document was simply a piece of commercial correspondence written by someone with uneven literacy. And Ase, Aldrich said, the man who testified. How did we find him? Bream said. He came forward. He volunteered his testimony. Yes. Without being asked. He approached one of our corporals in the village and said he had information. Aldrich looked at the paper on the table for a long moment. Then he stood up. I want you to find everything we have on Garrett Ossie, he said. Everything. Where he trades, who he knows, where his money comes from, how long he has been in Cairo. Bream looked at him steadily. You think the woman is innocent? I think, Aldrich said, that I almost made an irreversible decision based on two pieces of evidence, one of which may be wrong, and one of which came from a man who showed up uninvited, and I do not like what that tells me. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the courtyard. The pale morning light was on the stones. 30 soldiers had stood there an hour ago and watched him raise a sword and then lower it, and none of them had said a word. There is something else, he said quietly. This Calvern, a landowner in the Eastern Territories. I want to know if that name is in any of our records. He left Bream with the paper and walked back down the hall. He passed Colin Graft, who was carrying a tray with bread and a cup of water, presumably heading toward the room where Marin was sitting. Leave that, Aldrich said. I will take it. Colin looked at him with the very specific expression of a young man who is surprised, but knows better than to say so. He handed over the tray without a word. Aldrich carried it back down the hall and pushed open the door with his shoulder. Marin was still sitting where he had left her. She had turned slightly in her chair so that she was facing the window, and she was looking out at the pale sky. He set the tray on the table in front of her without speaking. She looked at it, then she looked at him. He sat down across from her again, and folded his hands on the table. While I have conversations that need to happen, he said, I want you to stay warm, and I want you to eat something, and if there is anything you need that is reasonable to provide, you are to tell Colin, the young man who will be outside this door. She looked at him for a moment. You believe me, she said. It was not a question, exactly. It was more like a person saying out loud something they are not yet sure they are allowed to believe. I believe, he said carefully, that I may have been given an incomplete picture. That is not the same thing, and I want to be honest with you about the difference. I am going to find out more. Until I do, you are safe here. She looked back at the tray. Then she picked up the bread and ate it slowly, looking out the window. He watched her for a moment, this quiet woman who had knelt in a courtyard and made her peace with ending, and then been brought in here, and been asked to open up something she had kept closed for a very long time. He thought about the marks on her arm. He thought about the layers. He thought about the fact that she had carried those years on her skin and never mentioned them, not once, during the council session. She had simply sat there and let the process move around her like water around a stone. He rose, straightened his coat, and walked toward the door. Duke Vane, she said. He stopped. Thank you, she said, for putting the sword down. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the doorframe. Then he said, Do not thank me yet. Wait until I have done something that deserves it. And he went out into the hallway, and the door closed softly behind him, and the morning continued to open up around the garrison as it always did, indifferent and pale and full of things that were about to change. Colonel Harwick Bream was not a man who slept well at the best of times. His mind had always run like a wheel left spinning, moving through problems even when he was lying flat on his back in a dark room willing himself to rest. So it was not unusual for him to be awake at the second hour after midnight, sitting at the small desk in his quarters with a lamp burning low, reading through documents. What was unusual was that these were not military documents. They were records, traders' licenses, movement papers, the kind of paperwork that passed through military checkpoints and got logged by corporals who were thorough enough to keep copies, and those copies had found their way to Bream's desk because he had asked for everything connected to the name Garrett Ossie. Ossie was a trader. That much was straightforward. He moved between the lowland settlements, primarily dealing in cloth and some grain, and had done so for approximately 4 years according to the records Bream had been able to find. He had no criminal record. He had no obvious associations with any of the known enemy networks. On paper, he was an ordinary man who did ordinary work and had, on one specific morning, walked up to one of Duke Vane's corporals and volunteered information that had resulted in the arrest and near execution of a woman named Marin Doyle. but Bream was very good at reading what was not on paper. And what was not on paper was this. In all 4 years of Garrett Ossie's documented trading activity, he had never once been recorded entering or leaving the settlement of Caro, not in any log, not in any checkpoint record, not in any payment ledger. Which meant that either the record-keeping in Caro was significantly worse than everywhere else, which was possible but struck Bream as unlikely given that the same checkpoint system was used across all of the lowland settlements, or Garrett Ossie had never actually been to Caro before the day of the arrests. Which raised the question of how Garrett Ossie had seen Marin Doyle meeting with anyone at all. Bream set the papers down and rubbed his eyes. He did not like where this was going. He liked Aldrich Vane. He had served under commanders he respected less, and commanders he trusted less, and commanders he simply found difficult in one way or another. And Vane was none of those things. He was precise. He was fair. He did not waste lives carelessly. And he had the quality, rarer than people realized, of being capable of changing his mind when presented with new information. Many commanders had that quality in theory and not in practice. Vane had it in practice, which Bream knew because he had watched it happen. The morning in the courtyard was the most dramatic example, but it was not the first. Still, changing his own verdict on a capital case, on the basis of a woman's word and a soldier's nagging doubt, was a different kind of thing. If Bream's suspicions about Ossie were right, then someone had deliberately set Marin Doyle up to carry evidence she did not understand, toward a verdict she would not survive, which meant someone had wanted her dead, which meant there was a reason for that, which meant the story was not about a simple village woman who had stumbled into the wrong company. He stared at the lamp. The flame was very small and very steady. He picked up his pen and wrote a note to himself in the margin of the page. Who knew she was in Caro, and for how long? He set the pen down. He thought about the document found in her coat. He had told Vane it could be a trading list, and that was true. He had not told Vane that. Looking at it again after that conversation, he had begun to feel something he would describe as professional embarrassment at himself. The pattern he had identified as code was a pattern, yes. But patterns appear in ordinary documents all the time, particularly when those documents are written by people without formal education who abbreviate in personal and inconsistent ways. He had been trained to look for code, and sometimes that training made a man find what he was looking for even when it was not there. He did not enjoy admitting this. But he was a careful man, and careful men, in Bream's experience, were willing to be wrong about specific things in order to be right about the larger picture. The morning was still several hours away. He gathered the papers together, tied them neatly, and set them in the center of his desk where he would not miss them when daylight came. Then he blew out the lamp and lay down in his clothes, because he did not feel like undressing. He stared at the ceiling in the dark. Who had wanted Marin Doyle dead? And more pressingly, did they know they had failed? Across the garrison, in the room with the long table and the fire that had gone cold, Marin herself was awake. She had been given a room later in the day, a small one near the back of the building with a narrow bed and a window that looked out onto the rear wall of the garrison. Colin Graft had brought her a blanket that was heavier than the one already on the bed and had left it without much conversation, which she appreciated. She did not want conversation. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap. Her arms were uncovered. She had pulled her sleeves back to the elbow, which she rarely did in company, and she was looking at the marks in the poor light. Not with the kind of look that comes from pain or from dwelling. It was more the look of a person checking something practical, the way you might check a door to make sure it is shut properly before going to bed. She had spent 6 years learning how to be invisible, how to take up as little space as possible, how to move through a room without drawing the eye. These were skills she had built as a matter of survival, and she had kept them long after the original need for them had ended, because that is what survival skills do. They outlast their context. They become the shape of a person whether they choose it or not. She had been invisible in the council room. She had been invisible in the courtyard. She had made herself so thoroughly without expectation that even the moment of her own ending had felt like something happening to a shadow of herself. And then the sleeve had slipped. She had not done it on purpose. She was certain of that. She never let her sleeve slip. It was a reflex so deeply built in that she did not even think about it anymore. But the rope on her wrists had pushed the fabric back, and she had been too focused on being still and quiet to notice, and the Duke had looked. She thought about his face when he crouched down. She had not been looking at him directly, but she had seen him in her peripheral vision, close enough that she could see his expression. It had not been what she expected. She had expected something like distaste, the way some people looked when they saw the marks, as if her past were something that reflected badly on her, or she had expected something like pity, which was its own problem. Because pity from powerful people very often curled into something harder at the edges. What she had seen on his face was neither of those things. He had looked, she thought, like a man who had just realized he had been reading a map upside down. She pulled her sleeves back down and lay back on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. She did not know what he was going to find. She did not know if what he found would be enough. She had told him the truth about the letter, and about Calvern, and about Dunfrey. But the truth was not always the thing that mattered most in these situations. She knew that. She had learned it the way you learn most important things, slowly, and at significant cost. But she thought about what he had said before he left. Do not thank me yet. Wait until I have done something that deserves it. She had known powerful men who gave assurances. She had known powerful men who made promises. She had known powerful men who said things with complete confidence and meant them completely in the moment, and then found, when the moment changed, that the meaning had changed too. This had felt different. She could not say exactly why. Maybe it was the fact that he had not given her an assurance. He had withheld one. He had been careful not to promise her something he was not certain he could deliver. That was unusual. That was the kind of honesty that cost something. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. Outside, the garrison was mostly quiet. She could hear the distant sound of a sentry making rounds, boots on stone, steady and slow. She could hear wind moving along the walls. She thought about the dog in Cairo, a brown dog with one ear that stood up and one that flopped. It had appeared at her door one morning without introduction, and had simply decided, apparently, that she was its particular concern. It would follow her to the market and sit outside the stalls and walk home beside her, and then sit at the bottom of the stairs that led to her room, and watch her go up with an expression of mild disappointment that she was not staying on the ground floor where it could keep a better eye on her. She wondered if someone was feeding it. She fell asleep thinking about the dog, which was in some ways the most peaceful thing that had happened to her in the past 3 days. In the morning, early, before the rest of the garrison had fully risen, Duke Aldrich Vane walked into Bream's quarters without knocking. This was his habit, and Bream had long since stopped expecting any different. He found his colonel already awake and already at his desk, which also did not surprise him. Bream handed him the papers without preamble. Aldrich read them. It took him some time because he read carefully. When he was finished, he set them down and stood for a moment with his hands behind his back, looking at nothing in particular. Ase was never in Cairo, he said. Not according to any record I can find, Bream said. Which means he either came and went without being logged, which is possible, but requires either incompetence or deliberate omission on the part of the checkpoint staff, or he was lying about where he saw her. Yes, Bream said. And if he was lying about where he saw her, Aldrich said, then his entire testimony is built on a lie. It is the logical conclusion, Bream said. Aldrich looked at the papers again. Find Aussie, he said. He left the area the day after the arrests, Bream said. I checked. Aldrich looked up at him sharply. You have already checked. I was awake at the second hour, Bream said simply. Aldrich absorbed this. Then he said, he left the day after. Not before, not during. The day after. The day after, Bream confirmed. Once he had delivered his testimony, and the verdict had been delivered, then he was gone. There was a brief, heavy silence. Someone sent him, Aldrich said. That is my conclusion, Bream said. Someone who wanted her dead and knew that she would be among the people arrested in Cairo and arranged for a witness to be there to make certain the evidence against her was sufficient. Yes, Bream said. He paused. The question I keep returning to is who knew she was in Cairo. It is not a large settlement. She has been there 2 years, which is long enough for her to be known locally, but she does not appear in any military record, any land record, any official document of any kind. She was, for all practical purposes, invisible. Aldrich looked at him. Except, Bream said slowly, to whoever she was hiding from. The word hung in the air between them. Aldrich thought about what Marin had told him. About Calvern. About walking out of his estate when he died and not looking back. He thought about what it meant to be a person that someone had owned, in the informal but entirely real way that some men owned people, for 6 years. And he thought about what it would mean to that kind of man, or to the people around that kind of man, to discover that the thing they had owned had walked away and built a quiet life somewhere, and was, by all appearances, doing reasonably well. Calvern is dead, he said. His estate, however, is not, Bream said. Whoever inherited it inherits his interests, his records, his grudges, and his alliances. Aldrich straightened. He turned toward the door. Find out who inherited Calvern's estate, he said, and find out if that person has any connection to Garrett Aussie. I am already looking, Bream said. Aldrich paused in the doorway. He looked back at his colonel with something that was not quite gratitude, since gratitude was not a word that sat comfortably in his vocabulary, but was in the same general territory. "You were awake at the second hour," he said. "I find sleep overrated," Bream said. Aldrich went out. He walked down the corridor in the early gray light of a garrison just beginning to stir. And he thought about a woman asleep in a narrow room at the back of the building. And he thought about a dog in a village that was probably wondering where she had gone. And he thought about the fact that he had very nearly done something irreversible. And he thought about what it meant that someone had built the whole situation so carefully that it had almost worked. Almost. He pushed open the door to the courtyard. The cold morning air came in around him. The stones of the courtyard were pale and damp. He stood there for a moment, looking at the spot where he had stood with his sword raised, and he thought about the specific weight of the sword when it was not used for what it had been lifted for. And he thought that there were things in this world that looked simple until they were not, and moments that looked like endings until they turned out to be something else entirely. He went inside to begin his day. There was a great deal of work ahead of him. It rained for the next 2 days. Not the heavy, dramatic rain that shakes a building and makes people feel the world is ending. Just a steady, quiet rain that came in from the east and settled over everything like a gray cloth, making the stones dark and the air smell of wet earth, and making every lamp in the garrison feel warmer by comparison. Aldrich did not mind rain. He had spent enough time in the field to have lost the habit of expecting comfortable weather. He spent those 2 days in the map room, at the table, with papers spread in front of him, and his colonel sitting across from him, and together they went through everything they had. The picture that assembled itself was not a comfortable one. Calvern's estate had passed, upon his death, to his nephew, a man named Edmund Harrell. Harrell was 42 years old, lived primarily in the Eastern Territories, and had a reputation that Bream described, with his customary understatement, as mixed. He was known as a man who paid his debts eventually, who traded in several things that were difficult to categorize precisely, and who had a particular talent for making problems disappear through methods that were never officially recorded. He was also known to have been very close to his uncle. Bream had found, through a chain of records and cross-references that had taken the better part of a day to construct, a financial connection between Edmund Harrell and Garrett Ossie. It was not direct. It went through 2 intermediate names and across what appeared to be 3 separate layers of routine transaction. But it was there. Ossie had received a payment from a merchant in the town of Feldern. That merchant received regular business from a company operating under the name Harrell Trading, which Bream had been able to determine was registered under a slightly different spelling, but at an address that matched a property owned by Edmund Harrell's household. It was not proof in the strict legal sense. It was not the kind of thing you could take to a court and have someone sentenced on. But in Aldrich's experience, when something walked and spoke and behaved like a particular kind of arrangement, it usually was that kind of arrangement. Someone connected to Edmund Harrell had paid Garrett Ossie to go to a military checkpoint, volunteer false testimony, and then disappear. He wanted her dead, Aldrich said. They had been over this already, but he said it out loud again because it helped him to hear the shape of a thing when he spoke it. He either found out where she had gone, Bream said, or he never stopped looking and eventually found her. 2 years, Aldrich said. She had been in Cairo for 2 years. Either it took him that long to find her, or he found her earlier and waited for an opportunity. A military sweep through her settlement would provide an excellent opportunity, Bream said. Arrests, confusion, a flood of prisoners coming through checkpoints, a woman with no papers and no family and nothing to distinguish her except the fact that she once belonged to his uncle. Put a letter on her. Provide a witness. Let the military do the rest. Aldrich looked at the map on the wall without seeing it. He was thinking about how thoroughly the plan had almost worked, how close it had come. Marin Doyle had sat in the council room and said nothing. She had knelt in the courtyard and said nothing. She had been within a heartbeat of dying without anyone except one man, who had happened to look at the wrong moment, knowing that she had been placed in that position deliberately. It was such a small thing. A sleeve slipping, the rope on her wrists pushing back the fabric, his eyes catching the movement. He thought about how many times in his life things had turned on something that small. He thought about battles that were won or lost because of weather that shifted by an hour, because of a messenger who took a wrong road, because of a horse that stumbled in the wrong place at the wrong moment. He had always thought of those things as accidents, random moments in which the universe demonstrated its indifference to human plans. He had never quite thought about what it felt like to be on the other side of such a moment, to be the person for whom the small thing went in the right direction instead of the wrong one. I need to find Ossie, he said. I am working on it, Bream said. He went east, which is not surprising if he was working for Harrell, since Harrell's base of operations is in the Eastern Territories. If he went east, he may be beyond our reach for the moment, Aldrich said. But Harrell is not. Bream looked at him carefully. Harrell is not a military target. No, Aldrich said, he is not. But he is within the civil jurisdiction of the region, and I have the authority to request an inquiry. If I present what we have found to the civil magistrate, what we have is circumstantial, Bream said. I know, Aldrich said, which is why I need more. He stood and went to the window. The rain was still coming down. A soldier crossed the courtyard below with his head down and his shoulders up against the cold. I want to speak to her again, he said. Marin Doyle, Bream said. She told me about Calvern. She did not tell me everything she knows about Harrell, probably because she was not sure it was safe to tell me, and probably because she has lived a long time with the principle that powerful men are best given as little information as possible. He turned from the window. I need to change that calculation for her. Bream said nothing. He was a man who, when he had nothing useful to add, added nothing. It was one of the things Aldrich valued most about him. Aldrich went down the hall to the room where Marin had been spending her days. She had been given things to do, at her own request. Specifically, she had asked Colin Graft if there was mending work that needed doing, since she said she found idleness difficult. Colin had found her a basket of work, and she had been at it steadily, which Aldrich found, in some way he could not precisely articulate, both sensible and quietly admirable. He knocked before entering, which was not his usual habit. She looked up from the work in her lap. He sat down across from her. I want to tell you what we have found, he said, and then I want to ask you something. She set the mending aside. She folded her hands in her lap. He told her about Harrell, about Osei, about the payment chain Bream had found. He told her plainly and in order, without dramatizing it or softening it. He watched her face as he spoke. She did not look surprised. That was the thing that stayed with him. She looked, if anything, as if something she had been carrying for a long time had just been confirmed. Not relief exactly. Something closer to the particular tiredness that comes when a thing you feared turns out to be real, because at least now you are no longer fighting the fear and the reality at the same time. Harrell, she said when he finished. You know the name, he said. It was not a question. He was at the estate sometimes, she said, when I was there. He and Calvern were alike in most ways that mattered. I was careful around him. Did he know you well enough to want to find you after you left? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he knew I had seen things that happened in that house, things that were said, and people who came and went, and arrangements that were made. I do not think he ever thought I would tell anyone, because who would I tell, and who would believe me? But knowing and telling are different things. He may have wanted to make sure the knowing was never a risk. Aldrich looked at her. What things did you see? She looked back at him steadily. I need to know, he said, if what you saw is relevant to what I am building. She was quiet for a long moment. He waited. He had learned, in these 2 days, that Marin Doyle's silences were not evasion. They were the time she needed to decide whether a door was worth opening. Then she began to speak. She spoke for a long time. The rain continued outside. The lamp on the table burned steadily. She told him about the people who came to Calvern's estate during the years she was there. She told him about conversations she had overheard, not because she had tried to eavesdrop, but because she had been expected to be invisible, and invisible people were often present in rooms where things were said that would not have been said in front of someone who was seen. She told him about money. She told him about names. She told him about arrangements between Calvern and certain men whose names she had not known then but whose descriptions, she said carefully, might mean something to someone who knew the Eastern Territories better than she did. Aldrich listened to every word. There was one moment, about 20 minutes into what she was saying, when he felt something change in him, not an emotional change, a structural one. The way a building changes when a load-bearing element shifts, and everything that was resting on it settles into a new configuration. He recognized a name she described, not the name Calvern had used for this person, but the description that went with it, the physical appearance, the manner, the specific region they operated in. It was a name he knew from military intelligence, a name that had appeared in his briefings as a suspected supplier to the enemy's eastern operations, a man who had never been found with any evidence sufficient for action, a man who had, by all appearances, never been connected to anyone like Calvern. He kept his face still. He let her finish. When she was done, he stood up and moved to the fireplace, and stood with his back to her for a moment, thinking. What she had just told him was not simply the story of why Edmund Harrell wanted her gone. It was something considerably larger. It was the first thread he had ever found that might lead, if pulled carefully and with patience, all the way to the supply chain that had been keeping the enemy fed and armed through the worst 2 years of the conflict. He turned around. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer." She was looking at him with those steady gray eyes. "What you have just told me," he said, "I would like to record formally, with a scribe present. Your account, in full, as a formal document. It would mean putting your name to it. It would mean being named as a witness in an inquiry. It would not be a quiet thing." She held his gaze. "I have been quiet for a long time," she said. "I know," he said. "And it did not keep me safe," she said. "No," he said, "it did not." She was quiet for just a moment longer, then she said, "All right." He nodded once. He went to the door and opened it, and called for Colin. He asked Colin to bring the garrison scribe and to be quick about it. Then he came back into the room and sat down. "This will not be easy," he said. "It will take time. The person you have described is well connected and will not be named and questioned without resistance. Harrell will not be called to account without political difficulty. There will be people who will not want this inquiry to proceed." "I understand that," she said. "I am telling you because I want you to go in with clear eyes," he said. "I am not promising you an easy outcome." "I do not expect easy outcomes," she said. There was something very dry in her voice. Not bitter, just factual. He looked at her across the table. "You are a surprising person," he said. She thought about this for a moment. "I do not think I am," she said. "I think I am very ordinary. I think ordinary people are more resilient than they are given credit for." He thought about that. He was still thinking about it when the scribe arrived, and they began the long, careful work of putting everything she knew into words that could survive outside the room. Outside, the rain continued. The garrison moved around them in its usual rhythms, and inside the room with the long table, a woman who had been invisible for most of her life began, methodically and in precise detail, to be seen. The scribe's name was Owen Fell, and he was 37 years old, a careful man with small, neat handwriting, and the useful quality of appearing to blend into the furniture of any room he occupied. He had served the garrison for 6 years and had recorded many things: military orders, depositions from prisoners, accounts of engagements and supply runs and disciplinary matters. He had thought, coming into the room, that this would be another deposition from a prisoner. He realized within 10 minutes that it was something considerably different. He wrote without comment. It was his job to be accurate, not to react, and he was good at his job. But later, in his own quarters, he would think about what he had written down that afternoon, and he would understand, in the way that people who deal with documents understand things, that what had been set down on those pages was the kind of document that changed the shape of situations. Marin spoke for nearly 2 hours. Aldrich sat across from her and asked occasional questions, careful ones, aimed at sharpening the detail in something she had said or filling a gap in the account. He did not lead her. He did not suggest answers. He asked what, when, and where, and let her find the words herself. Owen Fell's pen moved steadily across the page. When it was done, Owen read the entire account back to Marin slowly, and she corrected 2 small errors of transcription and confirmed the rest. She signed her name at the bottom of each page. Her handwriting was deliberate and clear. Owen Fell collected the pages and tied them and left the room. Aldrich and Marin sat in the quiet that followed. The lamp was burning lower. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed and boots went down the corridor and faded. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, which he had noticed was the way she treated most questions. She did not answer casually. She thought about it first. "Tired," she said. "But the good kind of tired. The kind that comes from doing something rather than from waiting." He understood that distinction. He lived by it himself. He stood and went to the window. The rain had eased a little, not stopped but slowed, so that the sound of it was softer against the glass. "There is something I want to tell you," he said. He did not turn from the window. He had found it easier sometimes to say a difficult thing when he was not looking directly at the person he was saying it to. Not because he was avoiding their response, but because there was something about the absence of eye contact that made the words come more cleanly. "When I stood in that courtyard, when I had the sword raised." She did not speak. "I had reviewed the evidence. I had heard the testimony. I had followed every step in the process as I was trained to follow it, and I was wrong. Not because the process failed, but because I trusted the process too completely, and did not ask the questions I should have asked before the verdict was delivered." He paused. "I have carried out my authority in this region for 4 years. In those 4 years I have made many decisions. I have been proud of most of them because I have done them carefully and with as much information as could be gathered. I did not know it was possible for the process to be used against itself, for evidence to be placed, and a witness to be arranged, and the whole machinery of justice turned toward an unjust end. He turned from the window. I am telling you this, he said, not because I need you to forgive me for something. You do not owe me anything in that direction. I am telling you because I think you deserve to know that the thing that almost happened to you was not random. It was constructed, and the fact that it failed was, for the most part, luck. I do not like that. I do not like that I was within one small moment of making an irreversible error based on a case that had been built to deceive me, and I am going to think very hard, going forward, about what I can do differently. Maren looked at him across the room. You are apologizing, she said. I am explaining, he said. It looks very much like an apology, she said. He said nothing for a moment, then he said, perhaps it is. She looked at her hands. I told you in that room, the first morning, that I stopped expecting answers from powerful men a long time ago. That was true, but I also stopped expecting this. She gestured slightly, a small motion that seemed to encompass the room and the conversation, and him standing at the window. I did not expect to be listened to. I did not expect anyone to go looking. I did not expect the person who was about to end my life to be the person who went looking. She met his eyes. I do not think that requires your apology, she said. I think it requires your continued attention. What you do next matters more than what you did before. He was quiet. That is not meant harshly, she said. I know, he said. It is meant correctly. She stood and pulled her coat a little closer. I am going to sleep, she said. I have to give my formal account tomorrow, and I want to be clear-headed. He stood as well. You will be, he said. I know, she said. There was something in the way she said it that was different from how she had spoken in the early days. A smallness had left her voice. Not that she had ever been loud or dramatic, but there had been something compact and defended in the way she spoke, and that thing had loosened, incrementally, over the weeks, until what remained was simply directness, clean and unguarded. She went up the stairs. He stood in the sitting room for a moment, looking at the door. Then he went out into the cold night to find Bream and give him the information about Nell. The fourth witness was found. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, and she was living in a small town called Dean with her sister's family, working as a seamstress, and had been there for 3 years. Bream sent a civilian, a woman from the magistrate's office who was specifically skilled in this kind of sensitive approach. And Eleanor Marsh did not close the door. She listened. She sat down. She said she had wondered, more than once, if the things she knew would ever matter to anyone. She came to the capital a week later, separately from Maren and Clara Bent, and provided her account independently to a different deputy of Eleanor Crofts. Her account was taken on its own terms, without any reference to the accounts already in the file. When Eleanor Croft compared the 3 accounts, there were 19 points of specific factual overlap. 19 details that 3 separate women, interviewed at different times and in different rooms by different people, had described in consistent terms. Harrell's legal team challenged the accounts. They did so in the way that had been anticipated, arguing constructed narratives and suggesting coordination. Eleanor Croft reviewed the process documentation and noted that the interviews had been conducted separately, at intervals, by different people, and that the 19 overlapping points were not points that would naturally occur to people constructing a false account, because they were specific and unglamorous, and several of them were details that only a person who had been in the particular rooms of that particular house would know. She delivered her preliminary findings in writing on a gray Thursday morning in late winter. Aldrich read them in the garrison, which he had returned to after the capital visit. He read them once, quickly, for the substance. Then he read them again, slowly, for the detail. The findings were not a verdict. They were a formal assessment that the evidence before the civil examination was sufficient to proceed to the full legal process. They established, in the magistrate's considered judgment, that the claims made in the formal record were credible and substantially supported. They recommended that the case proceed to the appropriate legal authority for adjudication. He set the document down. He thought about the morning in the courtyard. He thought about the blade and the cold air and the silence. He thought about a sleeve and a rope in 1 second. Then he sent a brief communication to Maren in the capital, where she was still staying while the formal process moved forward. It said, "The findings have come. The process will move forward. You should know." Her reply came the next day. It was 3 sentences. "I know," Clara told me. "I fed a pigeon this morning from the window and thought about the dog." He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, which was not a thing he did with official communications, and went out to find Bream. The military proceeding concluded 3 weeks later. It concluded with a formal finding against the supply arrangements, several significant financial penalties, and a recommendation for further criminal proceedings against 2 of the intermediate traders who had managed the arrangements. Edmund Harrell was not directly named in the military verdict because his involvement was established at one further remove, but his company and one of his employees were named, and the financial records made the connection clear. The civil proceeding moved into its formal legal stage. It was slower, as civil proceedings were. Harrell's legal team was tenacious and experienced, and they argued every point that could be argued. Eleanor Croft presided with the patience of someone who had all the time she needed and knew it. The 3 accounts sat in the file alongside the financial records and Ossie's testimony and the chain of evidence Bream had constructed, and Harrell's team moved around them without being able to move them. Aldrich attended several of the sessions. He sat in the gallery and watched the process and thought about the difference between a system that could be turned against itself and a system that was being used correctly. He thought about what Marin had said, "Change what you can change in the system you run." He had been thinking about that since she said it. He had started, quietly and without announcing it, asking more questions before verdicts were delivered. He had started reviewing the process of evidence gathering in his own garrison with a more critical eye. He had started paying attention to whose voices were being heard and whose were not, and asking himself whether the gap was a reflection of truth or a reflection of who the system was built to listen to. It was not dramatic work. It was not the kind of thing that made a story. It was just the ordinary daily work of a man who had learned something and was doing something with the learning. The verdict in the civil case came on a day in early spring, when the first thin green was showing at the edges of the garrison courtyard, and the air smelled of mud and new growth. Harrell was found liable on 3 charges. The specific language of the findings was formal and precise and ran to 11 pages. 2 of his employees were named in separate proceedings. The financial penalties were significant. The finding required a full accounting of all contracts and arrangements during the relevant period, which would keep several officials and lawyers occupied for months. It was not everything that could have been sought. The deeper criminal proceedings that might have followed from a fuller investigation of what had happened in Calvern's household did not materialize, because Calvern was dead and several of the more serious matters were legally difficult to pursue against his estate without Calvern himself available to answer. The civil system had its limits, and those limits meant that some things were acknowledged in the record without being fully addressed in the outcome. Aldrich was not satisfied with this. He thought about it for several days and concluded that not being satisfied was the correct response, and that the record itself mattered even when the outcome was incomplete, because the record existed and would exist, and truth in a document is not the same as truth that is spoken once and then forgotten. He sent a full written account to Marin. He did not know exactly what she would feel, reading it. He suspected she already knew the limits of what was possible, better than most people knew them, because she had spent years living inside those limits. He suspected she would read the 11-page finding and know, without being told, exactly which parts of it were the most important, and which parts were the compromise, and what was in the gap between them. He sent the account because she deserved to know, and because he had made a commitment in the early days to keep her informed, and he intended to keep commitments. Her response came 4 days later. It was longer than her previous notes. She wrote that she had read the document carefully. She wrote that she understood what it meant and what it did not mean. She wrote that she was grateful for the record, even knowing its limits, because the record was something that could not be taken back, and she had spent enough years in situations where the truth of her life could be easily erased, to know that having it written down in an official document and signed by a magistrate was not a small thing. She wrote that she was going home to Caro. She wrote that she had found the dog, which was fine, and had been fed by the family across the road, who had taken a liking to it. She wrote that she hoped, if he was ever in the area, he would not be a stranger. He read this letter in his quarters late in the evening with the lamp burning. He read it once. Then he folded it and held it for a while. He thought about everything that had happened since that cold morning in the courtyard. He thought about what had almost been, and what had been instead. He thought about all the things that had moved in the right direction because a sleeve had slipped and a pair of eyes had moved. He thought about what he had learned, which was not something he could put in a single sentence. It was not something he had learned in a single moment. It was something that had accumulated day by day through the specific texture of this particular situation, until it had become part of how he understood the world. He thought about looking, about what it meant to actually look at something rather than to process it. He thought about Marin Doyle, who had survived a great deal, and who had walked out of a dead man's house with nothing, and built something small and good, and who had been nearly taken from that, and who was going back to it now. He got up and went to the window. The spring night was cool and very quiet. The garrison was still around him. the way garrisons are still late at night, a particular kind of quiet that has people and purpose in it even when there is no sound. He stood there for a while. Then he went back to his desk and wrote a reply. He thanked her for writing. He told her, simply and in plain words, that he was glad she was well. He told her that he hoped Caro was everything she remembered it being. He told her that he would, if his work brought him in that direction, take her up on the offer not to be a stranger. He sealed it and left it for the Morning Post. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while in the way of someone who has put down something heavy after carrying it for a long time, and who is still adjusting to the particular quality of lightness that follows. Outside, the spring night continued. Somewhere in the garrison, a door opened and closed. Boots on stone, steady and slow. The sound of the world continuing in its ordinary rhythms, which is the sound, it turns out, of everything going right. He put out the lamp and went to bed. In a town called Caro, 3 days west, a woman with gray eyes and steady hands was sitting in her room above the street, listening to the night sounds of a place she had missed and had come back to. A brown dog with one ear up and one ear down was asleep at the bottom of the stairs. The town was quiet and cold, and exactly as she remembered it. She had a cup of something warm. She was not thinking about the courtyard or the sword or the long process of the past months. She was thinking about the morning, about what she would do first, about the market and the walk along the street and the cold river she washed her face in every morning. Small things, the right things, sufficient things. She drank her tea and looked out the window at the quiet street. The lamp burned low. She let it go out and sat for a little while in the dark, at peace. Garrett Ossie was found on a Tuesday. He was not found by soldiers, and he was not found by any dramatic means. He was found because Breen was very good at his work, and because traitors, however careful, leave traces. They leave traces in checkpoint logs, in payment records, in the accounts of small inns where they stop for a night and eat a meal and sign their name in a ledger because the innkeeper requires it. Ossie had changed his route after leaving the area around Caro, but he had not changed his name or his trade, and those two things together were enough. He was in a small town called Herne, 3 days' ride east, staying at an inn near the market. Breen's man found him there on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the common room with a cup of something warm, looking like a man who believed the matter behind him was settled. He was brought to the garrison under escort, not in chains, because there was as yet no formal warrant, but in a manner that made it clear the escort was not optional. He arrived on a Thursday morning looking pale and considerably less comfortable than he had in Herne. Aldrich met with him alone, except for Owen Fell in the corner with his pen and paper. Ossie was a medium-sized man, 40 or so, with the look of someone who had spent a lot of time outdoors and the manner of someone who was accustomed to talking his way through situations. He sat across from Aldrich with his hands flat on the table in a posture that was meant to project openness, and he said, very smoothly, that he was happy to help with any questions the Duke might have. Aldrich looked at him for a moment without speaking. There was a method he had developed over years of interrogation, not the harsh methods that some commanders relied on, not pressure or deprivation or any of the things that made a person say whatever they believed would make the discomfort stop. Those methods were unreliable. A person saying what they thought you wanted to hear was nearly useless. What Aldrich had found was that the most effective thing was often simply to know what you knew and to allow the person across the table to talk into the space that knowledge created. So he told Ossie what he knew. He did not tell him everything. He told him about the checkpoint records. He told him that Ossie had no documented presence in Caro in the 4 years of his trading activity. He told him that the payment from the merchant in Feldern had been traced. He laid it out plainly, in the same order and tone he might use to describe a weather pattern or a supply route. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He watched Ossie's face carefully, which was where all the useful information was. The openness left Ossie's face in stages. First the smooth, practiced ease, then the attempt at confusion, which was not very convincing, then something harder and more careful underneath, as the man recalculated what he was dealing with. I would like to explain, Ossie said. Please do, Aldrich said. What followed was a somewhat elaborate account that involved, at various points, a cousin's debt, a misunderstanding about the nature of what he had agreed to do, a claim that he had believed he was doing something that would help the military effort, and a steadily increasing willingness to tell Aldrich things about Edmund Harrell, as it became clear that the things Aldrich already knew were more than sufficient to establish what kind of situation Ossie was in. Aldrich listened carefully. Owen Fell wrote steadily. By the end of an hour, they had Ossie's full account of how he had been engaged, what he had been paid, and who had given him the instructions. He had not met Harrell directly. He had been approached by a man who worked for Harrell, whose name he gave. He had been told that there was a woman in Cairo who needed to be implicated in an enemy matter, and that his role was to confirm citing her meeting with a known associate of the enemy. He had been given a description of the woman, a rough time frame, and the name of the man she had allegedly been seen meeting. He had been paid 150 in coin, half before and half after, through the merchant in Feldern. When Aldrich was done, he had Owen Fell read the account back to Osse, who confirmed it and signed each page with a hand that shook slightly. After Osse was taken to a holding room, Aldrich sat in the empty room for a while with the signed pages in front of him. He did not feel the thing that people sometimes expected him to feel when things went in the right direction. He did not feel satisfaction or triumph. He felt something closer to the quietness that comes after a long piece of difficult work, a recognition that one stage had concluded and another was beginning. He went to find Marin. She was in the small room at the back of the building, but she was not mending. She was sitting at the window with her hands in her lap, looking out at the courtyard. She had been told that Osse had been brought in, because Aldrich had made a decision early on that he was going to keep her informed of what was happening. She deserved to know. He sat down and told her what Osse had said. All of it. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. He was paid to do it, she said. Yes, he said. She absorbed this. So it was not even personal. I was not even worth a personal decision. Someone simply paid a man to say a thing and I was meant to die for it. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. I am not saying it to feel sorry for myself, she said. I am saying it because I want to understand it correctly. Because if I do not understand it correctly, I might make the mistake of thinking it was about me. And I do not think it was about me. I think I was a problem to be solved, and this was the simplest solution. And that is a different thing. He looked at her. Yes, he said. That is exactly what it was. She nodded slowly. That is easier to deal with than the other thing, she said. The version where it is personal feels larger. This version is just practical, and practical things can be addressed practically. He thought about what she had just said for a moment. It was one of the clearest pieces of thinking he had heard in some time. Osse's account, he said, gives us the name of the man who acted as intermediary between him and Harrell. With that name and the financial records, we have a line of evidence that goes all the way to Harrell himself. It is not as direct as I would like, but it is sufficient for a formal inquiry. What does a formal inquiry mean? She said. It means that a civil magistrate will summon Harrell to answer questions under oath. It means the evidence will be examined by people who have the authority to act on it. It means that it becomes official, which makes it very difficult to quietly disappear. She looked at him steadily. And the supply chain? What you told me you believed about what he was doing during the war? That, he said, is a military matter, and it will be handled through military channels separately. The two inquiries will be kept distinct but will run simultaneously. The military investigation has more authority in its own domain and will move faster. So Harrell is facing two separate inquiries at the same time, she said. If we move correctly, Aldrich said. Yes. She looked out the window for a moment. He thought he was being very careful, she said. He thought he was removing the last thing that could unravel any of it. He was right that you were the last thread, Aldrich said. He was wrong about what happens when you pull a thread. She looked back at him. It unravels, she said. Yes, he said. The formal communication to the civil magistrate had already gone. The military investigation request was being drafted. Bream was handling the latter, as he was the most qualified person in the garrison to construct the case in the specific language the military court would require. Arthur Selke, in the capital, had been notified of the developments and had confirmed that his two sources were willing to provide formal statements. There was still a great deal that could go wrong. Aldrich was careful about this. He had seen cases that were solid on paper fall apart when they met the real world. Harrell was a man with connections and resources, and such men did not go quietly. There would be challenges to the evidence. There would be attempts to question the credibility of witnesses. There would be political pressure from people whose interests were entangled with Harrell's, some of whom Aldrich did not yet know about. But the architecture of the case was sound. It was built from multiple independent directions. The financial records, Osse's testimony, Marin's account, Selke's sources. No single piece could be removed without the others remaining. He thought about the morning in the courtyard again. He thought about how close it had come. He thought about all the cases before this one, cases he had seen or heard of where the architecture had not been sound, where the evidence had been fabricated and the witnesses had been arranged and there had been no sleeve slipping at the wrong moment, and no pair of eyes moving in the right direction. He thought about all the quiet mornings in all the courtyards of the world, where things that should not have happened had happened, and no one had noticed in time. He stood from the chair. You should know, he said. that this process will require you to be named publicly. Your account will be attached to the official record. It will not be possible to keep your involvement private. I know, she said. And that means Harrell will know the account came from you. I know, she said again. He may attempt to respond to that in some way, Aldrich said carefully. She looked at him directly. Are you telling me I will need protection? I am telling you, he said, that I am not going to leave you exposed. Not after all of this. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved across her face, very briefly. Not vulnerability exactly. Something more like the particular expression of a person who is being offered something they had stopped believing was available. All right, she said. He went to the door. Duke Vane, she said. He turned. The dog in Caro, she said. The brown one with the uneven ears. If anyone goes back through that way, I would like to know if it is still there. He looked at her for a moment. I will make a note of it, he said. He went out into the corridor and walked back toward the map room, thinking about the next steps, the communications that needed to be sent, the careful sequence of moves that had to be made before Harrell had any warning of what was coming. He was good at this kind of work, strategic sequencing, knowing which action to take in what order. But he was also thinking, in some quieter part of his mind, about a brown dog in a village, and about the detail that a woman had thought to ask about it, and about what it said about her that amid everything she had been through, she was thinking about whether a dog was being fed. He found it difficult to explain, even to himself, why that detail mattered to him. But it did. Edmund Harrell received the formal summons on a morning in early winter. He was at his estate when it arrived, a large house of pale stone set back from the road among bare trees, with a view of the river valley in the distance. He was sitting in the front room with papers on the desk and a fire at his back, when his steward brought in the sealed document from the civil magistrate's office and set it on the desk without comment. Harrell looked at the seal. He did not open it immediately. He looked at it for a moment in the way of a man who has spent enough years in the world to recognize the shape of a threat before he has confirmed its details. Then he broke the seal and read. His face did not change. This was a skill he had cultivated. He had spent many years in rooms with people he could not afford to show alarm in front of, and the habit of stillness was deeply built by now. He read the document through once, and then again, and then he set it face down on the desk and looked at the fire. He called for his steward and told him to send a message to a man named Corvin, who handled certain matters for him and who was not officially connected to his household in any documented way. He asked for Corvin to come to the estate before evening. Then he sat back and thought. He had believed the matter was closed. The woman had been arrested, the evidence had been placed, the witness had delivered his testimony and been paid and left the area. The military garrison at Caro had issued a verdict within a day. It had been exactly as it should have been. He had waited the appropriate period of time, and when no contrary information came, he had concluded that the process had run its course. He had been wrong. He could see that clearly now. Something had gone differently in that courtyard. He did not know what, because Ase had not reported any deviation from the expected outcome, and by the time he might have been in a position to report something, he had apparently been located and brought in for questioning himself. That was a problem. Ase knew enough to connect him to the arrangement, if Ase had been persuaded to talk. Harrell did not know whether Ase had talked, but the existence of the summons suggested that someone had found something, because a civil magistrate did not summon a man of his standing on the basis of nothing. He thought about what he was dealing with. He thought about Duke Aldrich Vane. He knew the name. He had known it for years, the way one knows the names of figures who exist within one's general sphere of operation without their paths ever directly crossing. Vane was known as a thorough man, not brilliant, in the sense of being unexpected or unconventional, but thorough. The kind of man who went over the same ground twice. The kind of man who asked a second question. Harrell did not enjoy finding himself on the other side of that quality. Corvin arrived before evening as asked. He was a thin man with careful eyes who listened more than he spoke and who had, over many years of handling things for Harrell, developed a very precise sense of what was actually being asked when Harrell spoke in the careful language he preferred. Harrell told him about the summons. He did not show him the document. He described its contents in general terms. Ase, Corvin said. Presumably, Harrell said. And the woman. Almost certainly, Harrell said. Corvin was quiet for a moment. The woman was supposed to be dead, he said. It was not an accusation. It was simply a statement of the original arrangement against which the current situation needed to be measured. She appears not to be, Harrell said. Then the account she has given, Corvin said, will be the foundation of whatever they are building. Without it, the financial records Vane may have found are circumstantial. With it, They have direction and context. Yes, Harrell said. Then the question is whether that account can be made less credible, Corvin said carefully. Harrell looked at him. A woman with no papers, Corvin said, no documented history, no family. A person who spent years in a private household with no official record of that time. It is not difficult to construct an alternative account of who she is, and what motivated her to make such claims. Harrell looked at him for a moment. Then he said, No. Corvin raised an eyebrow. I am facing a civil inquiry from a magistrate, Harrell said. I am facing, if Vane has done what I think he has done, a concurrent military investigation into the supply arrangements. If I am also found to have attempted to interfere with a witness in an ongoing inquiry, the situation becomes significantly more difficult. I am not going to make it worse by being seen to move against her now. Corvin was quiet. I am going to respond to the summons formally, through my legal representatives, and I am going to cooperate with the surface of the inquiry, while ensuring that the documentation my people produce for the deeper financial questions is as clean as it can be made at this stage. Harrell stood and moved to the window, and I am going to make sure that the people whose interests are entangled with mine are aware that this is happening, and that they have the same opportunity. Corvin nodded slowly. There are people in that group, Harrell said, who have significantly more to lose than I do, and significantly more resources to apply to the problem. Some of them will not want this inquiry to proceed. They will apply pressure through channels I do not need to manage directly. That is not something I am arranging. It is simply the natural consequence of the situation. Corvin understood. He had worked for Harrell long enough to understand how the man thought, which was several steps removed from direct action in all directions. He left before full dark. Harrell watched from the window as the man's horse went down the drive and disappeared into the trees. He stood at the window for a long time after. He thought about his uncle, Calvern, who had been many things and who was now gone. He thought about the years when the estate had been a particular kind of place, where certain things were arranged in certain ways, and how much of what he had built since rested on the foundation of those arrangements. He thought about what it would mean if that foundation was examined too closely. He thought about a woman he had seen occasionally, years ago, moving quietly through the rooms of his uncle's house. The kind of person who learned not to make eye contact, not to speak unless spoken to, not to take up space. The kind of person you stopped seeing after a while because they were so practiced at being overlooked. He had not overlooked her. He had watched her the way you watch something that might become a problem someday, with the careful, distant attention of a man who does not take risks on things he can instead simply monitor. And when Calvern died and she walked out, he had made a decision about how long to let her be, and where the boundary of acceptable risk lay. He had miscalculated. He acknowledged this to himself, which was something he could do privately even when he could not do it in any other way. He had believed distance and time and the woman's obvious desire to be left alone would be sufficient. He had waited too long, and when he had finally moved, he had moved through someone, as he always did, and that person had been brought back in by a man who looked twice at the same evidence. He moved away from the window. He was a man who had survived a great deal through the application of patience and the careful management of distance. He was not without resources. He was not without options. The inquiry would be slow. The political connections he had mentioned to Corvin were real, and they were not trivial, and they would not sit quietly while their own interests were threatened. It was not over. But he was also honest enough, in his private thoughts, to recognize that something had changed. The comfortable certainty he had lived with for several years, the certainty that the past was behind him, and that the last thread had been cut, was gone. He was going to have to fight. He was going to have to do it carefully, and through channels, and without giving anyone a reason to look more closely than they already were. He went to his desk and began writing. In the garrison, 3 days' ride west, Aldrich Vane received a communication from Arthur Selke that informed him, among other things, that Harrell had engaged legal representation and had sent quiet communications to 3 individuals in the capital, whose names Selke had been able to obtain. Aldrich read the communication in his quarters late at night with the lamp burning. He was not surprised that Harrell was moving. A man like Harrell did not receive a summons and sit still. The question was how quickly the countermoves would materialize and through what channels. He wrote 3 letters that night, one to Selke, with instructions on what to watch for, one to the military court contact who was handling the supply investigation, with a note about the potential for political interference, and one to Marin, which he left unsealed on his desk and did not send until morning because he was not satisfied with it the first time he wrote it, and rewrote it twice before it said what he wanted it to say. What he wanted it to say was that the situation was moving, that Harrell had been served, that the process was now official and on record and could not be quietly reversed, and that she should be prepared for the possibility that things would get complicated before they resolved. What he also wanted it to say, and what took him the 2 rewrites to figure out how to put, was that he was going to stay with this until it was done, not as a matter of obligation, not as a matter of duty, though it was that too, but because what had been done to her was a thing that should not have been, and because he was a man who found it impossible, once he saw something clearly, to look away. He did not put it in those words in the letter, he put it in plainer ones. But the meaning was the same. He folded the letter and left it for Colin to deliver in the morning. Then he sat in his chair and looked at the map on the wall and thought about Edmund Harrell sitting in his house of pale stone by the river valley, writing his own careful letters, making his own careful calculations, and he thought that there was a particular kind of man who believed that everything could be managed from a sufficient distance, and he thought that such men were sometimes right, and sometimes, when they ran into something they had not fully accounted for, wrong in ways that undid everything. He was going to do everything in his power to be the thing that Harrell had not fully accounted for. He went to bed late and slept badly and was up again before dawn. There was still a great deal of work ahead. The pressure came from the capital first. Aldrich had expected it to come from somewhere, which was why he had written to Selke, and why he had been careful, in every communication related to the inquiry, to use language that was precise and documented, and impossible to later recharacterize. What he had not fully anticipated was the specific form the pressure would take, which was a communication from a senior official in the civil governance structure suggesting, in the polished language such communications always used, that the inquiry into Edmund Harrell's affairs might benefit from a period of more careful consideration before proceeding to the formal examination stage. More careful consideration was a phrase that, in Aldrich's experience, meant a period in which the thing would be quietly shelved. He read the communication twice. He set it on his desk. He did not immediately respond to it. He thought about Harrell's letter writing, which Selke had confirmed, and he thought about which of the 3 names Harrell had contacted might be connected to this particular official, and he thought about the fact that someone with enough reach to access this official had been watching closely enough to move within 2 weeks of the summons being delivered. He was dealing with something larger than he had initially understood. He found Bream in the map room. He showed him the communication. Bream read it and set it down. "This is not from someone who is a direct ally of Harrell's," Bream said. "This is from someone who has received pressure and is transmitting it. The language is too general. If this person were directly invested, the language would be more specific." "Agreed," Aldrich said. "Which means the person who put pressure on this official is careful enough not to appear personally, which means we are looking at one of the 3 names Selke found. Do we know which one?" "I have a reasonable suspicion," Aldrich said. "Selke is working on confirming it." He sat down at the table. He had been awake early again, and had spent the hours before dawn going through the military supply records that had been sent to him as part of the parallel investigation. The picture they painted was detailed and damning, but it was also deeply embedded in the infrastructure of the supply system, which meant that there were people at multiple levels who had either been aware of what Harrell was doing, or had been positioned to benefit from it, without asking too many questions. "We have a problem," he said. Breen looked at him. "The military investigation is going to move faster than the civil one," Aldrich said. "The civil inquiry is where Marin's account is most directly relevant. The military investigation is focused on the supply arrangements, but if the military investigation gets to Harrell first and the civil inquiry is delayed by this kind of pressure, the outcome of the military case may resolve in a way that reduces the pressure on the civil case. If Harrell negotiates a settlement on the supply matter, he may use that to argue that the civil matter is redundant, or that the evidence has already been taken into account." Bream looked at this from several angles, in the way he did. "You think he will try to settle the military investigation quickly to take the civil one off the table?" "I think he will try, yes," Aldrich said. "Which means we need the civil inquiry to move faster than he is expecting it to." "We need more evidence," Bream said. "We need one more witness," Aldrich said. "Someone who can speak to the conditions in Calvern's household from direct knowledge, not just Marin. If we have 2 independent accounts of what happened there, the picture becomes much harder to dismiss." Bream thought about this. The household had other staff. "Yes," Aldrich said, "most of whom have scattered in the years since Calvern's death. But some of them were there for years. Some of them would have seen the same things Marin saw. Finding them would take time," Bream said. "Then we start now," Aldrich said. He sent for Owen Fell and dictated a series of communications to various record offices in the eastern region, asking for documented names of people who had been employed in the Calvern estate at specific dates. He was careful with the language, framing it as part of a property inquiry rather than anything that might alert Harrell's people. He also sent a note to Marin, asking if she remembered any of the names of the people who had worked in the household during her time there. Her response came back within the hour, written in her clear, deliberate hand. She remembered 4 names. She gave them with the same careful precision she gave everything, noting which years she believed each person had been there, what their role had been, and the last thing she had known about where they were when she left. One name, a woman named Clara Bent who had worked in the kitchen for several years, Marin believed had gone north to a town called Ashby after Calvern died, because she had mentioned it once. Aldrich handed the list to Bream without comment. Bream looked at it and nodded once. Clara Bent, he said. Ashby is 2 days north. I can have someone there within the week. Do it, Aldrich said. He went back to the communications from the capital. He composed a response to the official who had sent the suggestion about more careful consideration. He wrote it in the same polished language the original had used, with the same surface courtesy. He acknowledged the communication. He noted that the inquiry had been initiated according to proper procedure, and that the evidence upon which it rested was substantial and formally documented. He noted that any delay in the formal examination stage would need to be justified by specific procedural grounds rather than general concerns. He noted that he was confident the magistrate would proceed according to established process. He read it over. It was very polite. It was also completely immovable. He sealed it and sent it. Then he went to see Marin. She was in the yard, which surprised him slightly. She had asked Colin that morning if she could go outside, and Colin had seen no reason to say no, and so she was standing in the cold morning air, near the far wall of the garrison courtyard, her arms crossed against the chill, looking up at the sky. It was a clear day, very cold, with a sharp brightness to it. He crossed the yard and stood near her. Cold, he said. Yes, she said. I like it. He stood beside her for a moment. The clarity of the sky was extraordinary, the kind of blue that only appeared in winter, deep and very clean. We have sent someone to find a woman who worked in Calvern's household, he said. Her name was Clara Bent. Do you remember her? Yes, she said. She was kind. She was one of the few people there who was kind. We are hoping she can provide an account that supports yours. Marin was quiet for a moment. She was there for 6 years too, she said. She will have seen things. Do you think she will be willing to speak? Marin thought about this. I do not know, she said honestly. She was a private person. She kept her head down, the way most people in that house did. But she was not a coward. She was just careful. Aldrich nodded. They stood in the cold for a while without speaking. He had found, in the weeks of this process, that the silences between them were not uncomfortable. They were the silences of people who had both spent a great deal of time thinking about serious things, and did not feel the need to fill every moment with words. There is political pressure coming in from the capital, he said. She looked at him. Someone Harrell contacted is trying to slow the civil inquiry down, he said. I do not believe they will succeed, but I want you to know it is happening. She looked back at the sky. He is fighting, she said. Yes, he said. He was always going to fight, she said. I am not surprised. Neither am I, Aldrich said. But fighting and winning are different things. She glanced at him sideways. There was something in the look that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. That sounds like something you have said before, she said. Several times, he said. Usually to soldiers who were nervous before an engagement. And did it help? Sometimes, he said. She looked back at the sky. Duke Vane, she said. Aldrich, he said. It came out more easily than he expected it to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Aldrich, when this is over, whatever over means, I am going to go back to Caro. He said nothing. I want to go back to the room I had there, she said. I want to walk to the market. I want to feed the dog. He looked at the sky. I know that what I am doing here matters, she said. I know it is bigger than the room and the market and the dog. I know that the account I have given could affect things that are much larger than my own situation. I have thought about that and I am glad of it. She paused. But I want you to know that what I am hoping for, personally, is the room, is the quiet, is the ordinary life that someone tried to take from me. He thought about this. That seems, he said carefully, like a reasonable thing to want. I know it is small, she said. It is not small, he said. It is exactly the right size. She looked at him. He was looking at the sky. After a moment she said, thank you. He nodded once. They stood in the cold courtyard for a while longer, in the clear winter light. and then they went inside to continue the work. Clara Bent was found in Ashby on a Wednesday. She was working in a bakery, had been there for 2 years, and was described by Bream's man as a woman of about 50, who listened to the whole explanation before saying a word and then, after a long pause, said simply, "Tell me where to go." She arrived at the garrison 4 days later and was shown into a room where Marin was waiting. Aldrich did not go into that room. He waited in the hall. He heard, through the door, the sound of 2 people speaking, and then after a while the sound of one of them crying, which stopped and started and then stopped for good. Then a longer quiet. Then both voices again, lower and steadier. After an hour, he knocked on the door. Both women were sitting at the table. Clara Bent was a broad-shouldered woman with gray-streaked hair and the kind of face that had been shaped by a great deal of careful attention to the world. She looked at Aldrich when he came in with an expression he could only describe as measuring. "Your soldier," she said, "told me what happened." "Yes," he said. "He told me what almost happened," she said. "Yes," he said again. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" He sat down across from her and explained. She listened with the same kind of stillness Marin had, the stillness of someone who had spent years in environments where listening carefully was a survival skill. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I will tell you everything I know. I have wanted to tell someone for a long time, but there was never anyone to tell." She paused. "Calvern is dead," she said, "but the things he did are not." "No," Aldrich said. "They are not. And the people who knew about them," she said, "and who looked the other way because it served their interests." "Harrell," he said. "Harrell," she confirmed, "and others." He looked at her across the table. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Owen Fell was in the corner with his pen. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the cold, clear winter afternoon was moving toward dusk. Clara Bent's account was different from Marin's in its specifics, and similar in its essential truth. She had been in the household earlier, had seen things from a different vantage, had known different details, but the picture she built confirmed and extended the one Marin had built, and in 3 specific places, her account overlapped with Marin's, in ways that corroborated both. When she was done, she sat back in her chair and folded her hands. "I was not brave enough to do this while Calvern was alive," she said. "I want you to know that I know that." "You are here now," he said. "I am here now," she agreed, "because someone else was brave enough first." She glanced at Marin. Marin was looking at the table. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I was not brave. I was just alive when they expected me not to be." Clara Bent looked at her with the expression of a woman who had thought a great deal about what words meant and who was not satisfied with that answer. But she did not push it. She simply nodded. Aldrich stood. He had 2 accounts now. Independent, overlapping, detailed. He had financial records. He had Ossie's testimony. He had a military investigation running parallel through separate channels with its own evidence base. He had enough. The question was no longer whether he had enough. The question was whether the people who needed to act on what he had were willing to do so in the face of the pressure that was coming from Harrell's allies. He walked to the window. The courtyard was lit by the last of the afternoon light, pale and long across the stones. He had sent his response to the capital. He had made clear that the inquiry would proceed. He had no guarantees of what would happen next, but he had the architecture of the case, and he had the documents, and he had 2 women sitting at a table who had said what they had seen and signed their names to it. He turned back to the room. "You will both need to stay here for the time being," he said. "Not as prisoners, not even close to it, but as protected witnesses. I want to make sure that what you have given me is not put at risk by something careless." Clara Bent looked at Marin. Marin looked at Aldrich. "All right," she said. "All right," said Clara. He went out into the corridor. Colin Graft was waiting near the door, as he usually was, when something significant was happening. Aldrich gave him brief instructions about arrangements for Clara Bent's room and her comfort during her stay. Then he went to the map room and stood at the table and looked at the papers spread across it and thought about Edmund Harrell and his house of pale stone 3 days east, making his careful calculations, certain in the way that men like him were always certain that the mechanisms of the world could be managed and arranged and pointed in the right direction. He thought about the sleeve and the rope and the moment in the courtyard. He thought about small things and what they held. He picked up his pen and began to write the full summary of the case that would go to the magistrate's office and the military court simultaneously, timed so that both arrived on the same morning, giving Harrell's allies no window in which to address one without the other landing immediately after. He wrote carefully and thoroughly. He wrote for a long time. The formal examinations began on the first cold week of deep winter. Edmund Harrell was summoned to the civil magistrate's office in the regional capital, a stone building that sat at the top of a long hill overlooking the market district. He arrived with 2 legal representatives and a demeanor of cooperative patience that he had been practicing for the 3 weeks since the summons arrived. He was dressed well, but not extravagantly. He answered questions in measured, careful sentences. His representatives had made clear in advance, nothing to hide, and every willingness to assist in clarifying any misunderstandings about his business affairs. The magistrate was a woman named Eleanor Croft. She was 61 years old, had held the position for 14 years, and had the quality, which Aldrich found deeply reassuring when he met her, of being completely unimpressed by the quality of someone's legal representation. She treated every examination the same way, methodically, without drama, and with a patience that outlasted the patience of most of the people she examined. Aldrich attended the opening session. He sat in the gallery with Bream. He watched Harrell respond to the first round of questions, and he thought that Harrell was doing it very well. He was smooth and specific and cooperatively detailed about the things that were not the problem, and vague in a practiced and reasonable-sounding way about the things that were. But Eleanor Croft had the documents, and the documents were very specific. She walked through the financial records in order, piece by piece, and she asked Harrell to explain each one. Some of the explanations he gave were plausible. Some of them required his representatives to call for brief consultations before he answered. And some of them, the ones where Bream had found the connections that ran through 3 layers of transaction to the Harrell Trading Company, produced pauses that were fractionally longer than the others. The first day of the examination did not produce a dramatic outcome. It rarely did. But it produced something equally important, which was a formal record of Harrell's responses under oath, which meant that anything he said could be compared later to the documentary evidence, and any discrepancy between his account and the documents would compound his difficulty. In the parallel proceeding, the military court was examining the supply contracts. This moved faster, as Aldrich had anticipated, because military courts had more direct authority and less patience for procedural delays. The supply chain evidence was extensive and specific, and 3 of the intermediate traders who had handled goods through the Harrell-connected company had, when faced with the military court's rather more direct approach to questioning, provided accounts that were considerably more detailed than Edmund Harrell's. Selke, in the capital, sent a communication on the 4th day of examinations. The political pressure that had been applied through the capital official had quieted. The 3 individuals Harrell had contacted had, Selke believed, concluded that the situation was proceeding further than they had thought it would, and that being seen to actively interfere was now a greater risk than staying away. One of them had apparently retained his own legal representation, which Selke considered a good sign, since people who retained legal representation were generally more focused on protecting themselves than on protecting others. Aldrich read this communication in his quarters and found it encouraging without allowing himself to find it reassuring. Things could still change, cases could still fall apart, but the direction was consistent, and the consistency had held for long enough that he was beginning to believe it was structural rather than temporary. Marin and Clara Bent traveled to the regional capital together to provide their accounts to the civil magistrate's office. Aldrich arranged an escort, and he traveled with them himself for the first part of the journey, because the road east passed through areas where Harrell's people still moved freely. He did not explain this to Marin in terms of threat. He said simply that he had business in the same direction, and they might as well travel together. She looked at him with the expression she had for things she saw through clearly, but was not going to argue with. The journey took 2 days. They stopped at an inn the first night, a decent one in a market town, and Aldrich found himself sitting at a table in the common room with Marin and Clara Bent and Bream, eating a plain meal while the fire burned in the corner and travelers moved around them, and thinking that this was a quietly unusual thing. He was not someone who ate with people he was protecting. He was someone who sent people with soldiers and received reports. But this situation had not followed the ordinary patterns from the beginning, and he was finding that he did not particularly want it to. Clara Bent turned out to have opinions about almost everything, and to express them in a manner that managed to be both blunt and pleasant at the same time. She and Bream, somewhat unexpectedly, found a great deal to agree about on the subject of how poorly kept most official records were, and the conversation moved from that into other areas while Aldrich listened and Marin ate quietly and watched the fire. "You are comfortable with silence," Clara said at one point, looking at Marin. "I spent a long time in situations where speaking was costly," Marin said simply. "And now," Clara said. Marin thought about it. "Now I am choosing it," she said. "That is different." Clara nodded as if this made complete sense, which it did. They reached the capital the following afternoon. The magistrate's office had arranged accommodation for the witnesses, which was handled efficiently and without fuss by a deputy of Eleanor Crofts who managed all such logistics with the same calm competence her superior brought to the examinations themselves. Aldrich saw Marin and Clara settled and then went to a meeting with Eleanor Croft that had been arranged for the evening. They sat across from each other in a small office at the back of the magistrate's building. She had a cup of tea and offered him one, which he accepted. She went through the status of the examination with him in precise, organized terms. She outlined what had been established, what remained to be clarified, and where she believed the examination was heading. His legal representatives are skilled, she said. They are going to try to separate the supply matter from the civil matter. They are going to argue that the two things are distinct cases and that what happens in the military court should not influence the civil findings. Are they correct? He said. Legally, there is some basis for that argument, she said. But the two cases share witnesses and documentary evidence, and the facts of the one are not separable from the facts of the other in any meaningful way. She paused. My concern is the credibility challenge they will mount against your primary witness. Marin Doyle, he said. She is a woman with no documented history for significant periods of her life, Croft said. No family, no paper record, no institutional connection. His representatives are going to argue that this makes her account unverifiable. Clara Bent provides independent corroboration, he said. She does, Croft agreed, and that is significant. But they will argue that Bent and Doyle had time together, at your garrison, before providing their formal accounts, and that their accounts may have been shaped by that contact. The accounts were taken separately, he said. I know, she said, and I reviewed the transcripts. The overlapping details are specific enough that I do not believe they were constructed, but I am not the one his legal team needs to convince. In a challenge before a review panel, the argument will be made. He thought about this. What would strengthen the case against that challenge, he said. A third account, she said. Someone else from that household. Someone who had no contact with Doyle or Bent before providing their account. He looked at the papers on her desk. The list Marin gave us had 4 names, he said. We found Clara Bent. We have been looking for the other 3. I know, she said. I would put resources into that search. He left her office and walked through the cold evening of the capital. The streets were lit with lanterns, and people moved purposefully along the broad pavements, the business of the city continuing indifferent to the proceedings in the stone building on the hill. He walked for a while without going anywhere in particular, thinking. He had been in dozens of situations in his military career that had required him to keep his nerve through a period of uncertainty. He had held positions that looked impossible. He had managed resources that were insufficient. He had waited for reinforcements that were late. He had very particular experience of the kind of sustained attention that was required to get through a long, difficult process without making a mistake in the period when you were most tired of the difficulty. He thought this was like that. He went back to the accommodation the magistrate's office had arranged and requested a brief meeting with Marin. She came to a small sitting room near the entrance. She was wearing a heavier coat than she had arrived in, which he suspected Clara Bent had provided. She sat down across from him. He told her what Croft had said about the challenge to her credibility. He told her what it would require to strengthen the case against that challenge. He told her plainly that it was possible a third witness from Calvern's household could be found, and possible that one could not. She listened to all of it. I know 2 of the other 3 names on the list are people who are not likely to come forward, she said. One of them was loyal to Calvern in a way that went beyond employment. The other is old and frightened, and I would not want to force anything from him. She paused. But the 4th name, the woman I called Nell, I did not give her full name because I did not know it, but I know something about where she went when she left. He looked at her. She told him. It was specific. A town, a relation she had mentioned once, a particular kind of work she had said she hoped to find. He wrote it down. If you find her, Marin said, do not send a soldier, or if you do, send one who looks like a person first and a soldier second. She will not respond to an official approach. Breen will handle it, he said. She nodded. He is a careful man, she said. He looked at her. You have been watching us, he said. I am always watching, she said simply. It is an old habit. He thought about the 6 years and what it had meant to be so completely overlooked that you could watch freely, and what you built when that was the only kind of attention available to you. I am sorry, he said. She looked at him without expression. Not for a specific thing, he said, for the general shape of it, the years of it. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, Aldrich, you did not cause any of it. No, he said, but I represent a system that did not prevent it, and that is not entirely separate. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "When it is over, when this is settled and I go back to Caro, will you still think about it?" "Yes," he said honestly. "Good," she said. "Then do something with the thinking. Change what you can change in the system you run. That is more useful than any apology." He was quiet. "That is not meant harshly," she said. "I know," he said. "It is meant correctly." She stood and pulled her coat a little closer. "I am going to sleep," she said. "I have to give my formal account tomorrow, and I want to be clear-headed." He stood as well. "You will be," he said. "I know," she said. There was something in the way she said it that was different from how she had spoken in the early days. A smallness had left her voice. Not that she had ever been loud or dramatic, but there had been something compact and defended in the way she spoke. And that thing had loosened, incrementally, over the weeks, until what remained was simply directness, clean and unguarded. She went up the stairs. He stood in the sitting room for a moment, looking at the door. Then he went out into the cold night to find Bream and give him the information about Nell. The verdict in the civil case came on a day in early spring, when the first thin green was showing at the edges of the garrison courtyard and the air smelled of mud and new growth. Harrell was found liable on 3 charges. The specific language of the findings was formal and precise, and ran to 11 pages. 2 of his employees were named in separate proceedings. The financial penalties were significant. The finding required a full accounting of all contracts and arrangements during the relevant period, which would keep several officials and lawyers occupied for months. It was not everything that could have been sought. The deeper matters were legally difficult to pursue without Calvern himself available to answer. The civil system had its limits, and those limits meant that some things were acknowledged in the record without being fully addressed in the outcome. Aldrich was not satisfied with this. He thought about it for several days and concluded that not being satisfied was the correct response, and that the record itself mattered even when the outcome was incomplete, because the record existed and would exist, and truth in a document is not the same as truth that is spoken once and then forgotten. He sent a full written account to Marin. He did not know exactly what she would feel, reading it. He suspected she already knew the limits of what was possible, better than most people knew them, because she had spent years living inside those limits. Her response came 4 days later. She wrote that she had read the document carefully. She wrote that she understood what it meant and what it did not mean. She wrote that she was grateful for the record, even knowing its limits, because the record was something that could not be taken back, and she had spent enough years in situations where the truth of her life could be easily erased, to know that having it written down in an official document and signed by a magistrate was not a small thing. She wrote that she was going home to Caro. She wrote that she had found the dog, which was fine, and had been fed by the family across the road, who had taken a liking to it. She wrote that she hoped, if he was ever in the area, he would not be a stranger. He read this letter in his quarters late in the evening with the lamp burning. He read it once, then he folded it and held it for a while. He thought about everything that had happened since that cold morning in the courtyard. He thought about what had almost been and what had been instead. He thought about all the things that had moved in the right direction because a sleeve had slipped and a pair of eyes had moved. He thought about what he had learned, which was not something he could put in a single sentence. It was not something he had learned in a single moment. It was something that had accumulated, day by day, through the specific texture of this particular situation, until it had become part of how he understood the world. He thought about looking, about what it meant to actually look at something rather than to process it. He thought about Marin Doyle, who had survived a great deal and who had walked out of a dead man's house with nothing and built something small and good, and who had been nearly taken from that, and who was going back to it now. He had started, quietly and without announcing it, asking more questions before verdicts were delivered. He had started reviewing the process of evidence gathering in his own garrison with a more critical eye. He had started paying attention to whose voices were being heard and whose were not, and asking himself whether the gap was a reflection of truth or a reflection of who the system was built to listen to. It was not dramatic work. It was not the kind of thing that made a story. It was just the ordinary daily work of a man who had learned something and was doing something with the learning. He got up and went to the window. The spring night was cool and very quiet. The garrison was still around him, the way garrisons are still late at night, a particular kind of quiet that has people and purpose in it even when there is no sound. He stood there for a while. Then he went back to his desk and wrote a reply. He thanked her for writing. He told her, simply and in plain words, that he was glad she was well. He told her that he hoped Caro was everything she remembered it being. He told her that he would, if his work brought him in that direction, take her up on the offer not to be a stranger. He sealed it and left it for the Morning Post. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while, in the way of someone who has put down something heavy after carrying it for a long time, and who is still adjusting to the particular quality of lightness that follows. Outside, the spring night continued. Somewhere in the garrison, a door opened and closed. Boots on stone, steady and slow, the sound of the world continuing in its ordinary rhythms, which is the sound, it turns out, of everything going right. He put out the lamp and went to bed. In a town called Cairo, 3 days west, a woman with gray eyes and steady hands was sitting in her room above the street, listening to the night sounds of a place she had missed and had come back to. A brown dog with one ear up and one ear down was asleep at the bottom of the stairs. The town was quiet, and exactly as she remembered it. She had a cup of something warm. She was not thinking about the courtyard or the sword or the long process of the past months. She was thinking about the morning, about what she would do first, about the market and the walk along the street and the cold river she washed her face in every morning. Small things, the right things, sufficient things. She drank her tea and looked out the window at the quiet street. The lamp burned low. She let it go out and sat for a little while in the dark, at peace. Years later, people in the region would still speak of the morning the Duke raised his sword and then lowered it, of the sleeve that slipped, of the marks that told a different story than the one that had been arranged. They spoke of it the way people speak of things that could have gone wrong and did not, with a particular kind of careful gratitude, as if the telling itself might protect against the next time something almost went wrong and needed someone to look carefully at exactly the right moment. Aldrich Vane continued in his position for many years after. He changed things, gradually and without ceremony. He built into the process of his garrison a requirement that evidence be reviewed by more than one person before a verdict was delivered. He built in a requirement that a person facing judgment be given a chance to speak before a panel, rather than only before the single officer who would carry out the sentence. Small procedural changes, unglamorous ones, the kind that do not make histories but that, over years, shift the direction of outcomes for people who would never know how close they came to being on the wrong side of a moment. He visited Cairo once, in the autumn of that same year, when his route took him close enough that not stopping would have been a choice, rather than simply a matter of direction. He found the market on a bright, cool morning and walked through it and saw her at a stall near the far end, looking at cloth, the same deliberate way she did everything. The dog was at her feet. He did not approach immediately. He stood at a small distance and watched for a moment, not in any uncomfortable way, simply in the way of a person who has thought about something for a long time and wants a second to let the reality of it settle before stepping into it. She looked up and saw him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "You came." "I said I would," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said, "you did." They walked through the market together, and then along the street above the river, and the dog walked between them with its mismatched ears and its absolute certainty that this was exactly where it should be. The morning was cold and very clear, the kind of morning that makes you feel, without being able to say exactly why, that the world is basically sound. They talked about ordinary things, and some things that were not ordinary, and some things that were somewhere in between. She told him about Cairo and he told her about the garrison, and they each said a little more than they had intended to, and neither of them minded. He stayed for the better part of the day and left before dark. On the road back, riding through the pale autumn afternoon, he thought about the morning in the courtyard one more time. He thought about it not with the weight he had carried it before, but with something quieter, something that had settled into a different shape over the months. It was still there. It was always going to be there. The knowledge of how close it had come, the knowledge of what one moment could hold, the knowledge that the difference between an ending and a continuation could be as small as a piece of fabric shifting over a rope. But it was not a burden anymore. It was a fact, and facts, in Aldrich's experience, were things you worked with rather than things you were worked over by. He rode on through the afternoon. The light was good. The road was clear. Behind him, in a town called Cairo, a woman with gray eyes was sitting in her room with the lamp on and a cup of something warm and a dog at the bottom of the stairs. And outside the window, the ordinary evening of an ordinary town was doing exactly what ordinary evenings do, moving gently through its hours toward the quiet dark and then, without ceremony, toward the morning.